They thought I would stay silent, that I would accept being erased from my own family like a fading shadow. But they forgot one thing: I was no longer the obedient daughter they once knew. I had been preparing for years, and when they cast me aside, they had unknowingly opened the door for me to walk through with the truth clutched firmly in my hands. My name is Rachel Monroe, and I learned that blood means nothing when there's money involved. It was 11:30 on a Tuesday night when my world cracked open like an egg. I had driven to my parents' house in Cleveland Heights to drop off the medication Dad had forgotten at my apartment after his doctor's visit. The front door was unlocked, as always. Mom never could remember to turn the deadbolt, so I let myself in quietly, not wanting to wake them. That's when I heard voices drifting from the kitchen, not the hushed whispers of people trying not to disturb sleeping neighbors, but the confident tones of conspirators who believed they were alone. "Your sister!" Dad's voice carried that dismissive edge I'd heard him use with telemarketers. "She doesn't deserve a dime. She's out." I froze in the hallway, my hand still gripping the prescription bottle. The familiar ache of being unwanted settled in my chest, but this time it felt different, final. "I know it sounds harsh." Mom's voice joined in, softer but no less cutting. "But Harold's right. Elise has always been more invested in the family business, more committed." "Exactly." That was my sister Elise, her voice bright with satisfaction. "Rachel's never shown real interest in Monroe and Sterling Capital. She's always been too busy with her little graphic design projects to care about what actually matters." Little graphic design projects. I'd built a successful freelance business from scratch, but to them, anything that didn't involve the family investment firm was child's play. "The will needs to reflect reality," Dad continued. "Elise understands the business, understands what Grandmother Evelyn would have wanted for the company's future. Rachel would probably just sell everything off the moment she inherited." I pressed my back against the cool wall, grateful for its solid support as my legs threatened to give out. They weren't just cutting me out of the inheritance. They were rewriting history, painting me as the ungrateful daughter who'd abandoned the family legacy. "What about the house?" Elise asked. "Grandmother's place on Shaker Boulevard." "Everything goes to you, sweetheart," Mom said, and I could picture her reaching across the table to pat Elise's hand the way she always did when she was particularly pleased with her favorite daughter. The house, the portfolio, the business shares, all of it. "Rachel won't fight it, will she?" There was genuine concern in Elise's voice, as if she suddenly remembered I was a real person with feelings and legal rights. Dad's laugh was dry as autumn leaves. "What's she going to fight with? She doesn't have the resources for a legal battle, and she certainly doesn't have the stomach for it. Rachel's always been the peacekeeper. Remember, she'll accept it and move on, just like she always does." The prescription bottle slipped from my numb fingers, clattering against the hardwood floor. The kitchen went silent. What was that Mom's voice, sharp with alarm? I didn't wait to find out if they'd investigate, moving with the practiced silence of someone who'd spent years tiptoeing around this house. I backed toward the front door, scooped up the fallen bottle, and slipped outside into the October night. The drive back to my apartment passed in a blur of streetlights and stop signs. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached, but I couldn't seem to loosen my hold. It was the only thing keeping me anchored to reality. Back in my kitchen, I sat at the small table where I'd eaten countless solitary dinners and stared at Dad's medication, metformin for his diabetes. I'd picked it up without being asked, just like I'd done 100 other small favors over the years. The dutiful daughter, the reliable one, the one who could always be counted on to help and never complain. The one who didn't deserve a dime. I thought about calling them, confronting them immediately while the shock and hurt were still fresh. But something held me back. Maybe survival instinct. Maybe the first stirring of something darker and more calculating than mere hurt feelings. They thought they knew me, thought I was predictable, controllable, forgettable. They'd been erasing me from the family story so gradually that I'd barely noticed it happening, like watching my own reflection fade in a slowly darkening mirror. But they'd made one crucial miscalculation. They'd forgotten that I was Grandmother Evelyn's granddaughter too, and she'd never been one to back down from a fight. I pulled out my laptop and began typing, my fingers moving across the keys with purpose for the first time in months. If they wanted to play family politics, if they wanted to rewrite the Monroe legacy with me written out of it entirely, then they were about to learn that even the quietest mouse can bite back when cornered. The game had begun, and they didn't even know they were playing. The signs had been there all along. I just hadn't wanted to see them. Sitting in my apartment at 2:15 in the morning, surrounded by the glow of my laptop screen, I began tracing the careful architecture of my own erasure. It was like watching a slow-motion assassination, death by 1,000 small cuts that I'd somehow convinced myself were accidents. The family group chat had been the first casualty. Monroe Family Updates, a cheerful thread where Mom shared photos of Dad's golf games and Elise posted pictures from her business trips. I'd been an active participant until sometime last spring when my messages simply stopped appearing. When I'd asked Elise about it over lunch, she'd waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, you know how technology is. These group chats are always glitching." But technology doesn't glitch selectively. It doesn't choose to exclude one specific person while including everyone else. Then there were the photographs. I pulled up Mom's Facebook page and scrolled through months of family gatherings I'd attended but somehow didn't appear in. The 4th of July barbecue at their house. There was the picnic table where I'd sat. But the photo was cropped to show only Dad, Mom, and Elise raising their beer bottles in a toast. Dad's birthday dinner at the country club. I could see my empty chair pushed neatly against the table. Evidence of my presence carefully edited out of the frame. The most damning was from Grandmother Evelyn's memorial service last December. I'd given the eulogy, had spent weeks writing about her strength and wisdom, her refusal to accept limitations. But in the family photos posted online, I was a ghost. Elise stood prominently beside the casket in her black Chanel suit, the grieving granddaughter, the family's future. In the background, you could catch just a glimpse of my sleeve, a fragment of my profile, but nothing that would identify me as part of the Monroe legacy. I opened my email and searched for Monroe family. The pattern emerged like a connect-the-dots puzzle I'd been too naive to complete. Business dinner invitations that included Harold, Marjorie, and Elise Monroe. Holiday cards addressed to the Monroe family with photos that somehow never quite managed to include me. Wedding invitations for distant cousins that arrived at my parents' house but never made it to my mailbox. The family business had been the most masterful execution of all. Monroe and Sterling Capital, founded by my great-grandfather in 1942, had always been presented as a family legacy that would pass to the next generation. But when clients were introduced to the family, it was always Harold and his daughter Elise, never Harold and his daughters. I remembered the awkwardness I'd felt at company holiday parties, standing slightly apart while Dad explained Elise's role in acquisitions, her MBA from Northwestern, her vision for expanding into sustainable investments. When people asked about me, the conversation would smoothly redirect. "Oh, Rachel's very creative. She does graphic design work." As if creativity were a consolation prize for those too flighty to handle real business. Elise had been positioned as the heir apparent so gradually that even I had accepted it as natural. She was older by 3 years, had the business degree, understood finance in a way that came as naturally as breathing. She belonged in those mahogany-paneled conference rooms with their oil paintings of stern-faced men in expensive suits. I was the artistic one, the dreamer, the one who was supposed to be grateful for whatever scraps fell from the family table. But now I saw the calculation behind every choice. The way Elise was always mentioned first in introductions. The way she got the corner office at the firm while I wasn't even offered a summer internship. The way family traditions were subtly restructured around her schedule, her preferences, her vision for what the Monroes should become. They'd been grooming her to be the sole inheritor for years, carefully constructing a narrative where my exclusion would seem logical. Even inevitable. The black sheep sister who'd chosen art over assets, independence over family loyalty. Who could blame them for leaving everything to the daughter who'd actually shown up? Except I had shown up. For every birthday, every holiday, every crisis that required a supportive family member to manage logistics while the important people handled important things. I'd organized Mom's surprise 60th birthday party, coordinated care for Dad after his heart attack 2 years ago, spent my own money on gifts and flowers and the 1,000 small gestures that keep families functioning. But those contributions didn't photograph well. They didn't impress clients or build portfolios or secure the family's financial future. They were invisible, like I was becoming. I closed my laptop and walked to the window overlooking the city. Cleveland spread out below me in pools of amber light and deep shadow. Somewhere out there, in their grand house in Cleveland Heights, my family was sleeping peacefully, secure in their plans and confident in their assumptions about who I was and what I would accept. They thought they knew me because they'd written the story of who I was supposed to be. The quiet daughter, the reliable one, the one who could be counted on not to make waves even when she was drowning. But they'd forgotten something crucial. I was also Grandmother Evelyn's granddaughter, and she'd taught me that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone underestimates. Tomorrow, I would begin collecting evidence. Tonight, I would mourn the family I'd thought I belonged to, the people I'd believed loved me despite my flaws rather than planning around them. The erasure had been methodical and thorough. My response would be the same. Grandmother Evelyn's house had been sitting empty since her death, waiting for the family to decide what to do with 40 years of accumulated memories. Mom kept putting off the task of sorting through everything, claiming it was too emotional, while Elise was always too busy with work. That left me, as usual, to handle the unpleasant necessities. I'd been putting it off too, but 3 days after overhearing their kitchen conspiracy, I drove to the Old Victorian on Shaker Boulevard with a different purpose than mere nostalgia. If there were answers to be found, they would be here, in the place where Grandmother Evelyn had spent her final years watching our family with those sharp hazel eyes that missed nothing. The house still smelled like her, lavender and old books, with an undertone of the peppermint tea she'd drunk every afternoon at 4 o'clock sharp. I stood in the foyer for a moment, letting the familiar weight of the place settle around me. This house had been my refuge as a child, the one place where I felt completely understood. Rachel sees things differently. Grandmother Evelyn used to tell my parents when they'd complain about my impractical dreams. That's not a flaw to be corrected. It's a gift to be protected. I started in her study, methodically going through the antique roll-top desk where she'd handled her personal correspondence. Bills paid and filed with military precision, thank you notes for charity donations, letters from old friends, all the paper trail of a life lived with intention. But nothing unusual, nothing that would explain the certainty in her voice when she'd told me, just weeks before she died. Don't let them make you small, Rachel. You're stronger than they think. It was nearly 7:30 in the evening when I found it. Hidden behind a loose panel in the back of her bedroom closet, tucked between winter coats that still held the ghost of her perfume, was a manila envelope sealed with red wax. My name was written across the front in her careful script, for Rachel Monroe, when the truth becomes necessary. My hands trembled as I broke the seal. Inside were 3 items that would change everything: a handwritten letter, a small digital recorder, and a document that made my breath catch in my throat, a codicil to her will, properly witnessed and notarized, dated just 2 months before her death. I opened the letter first, and Grandmother Evelyn's voice seemed to speak directly from the page. My dearest Rachel, if you are reading this, it means they have done exactly what I feared they would do. Your father was always weak when it came to money, and your mother has never seen past Elise's carefully constructed facade. But I have been watching, and I have been planning. You are the only one who remembers that I was more than just a gentle grandmother. I built a life from nothing after your grandfather died. fought battles that would have broken softer women, and learned that the only protection against betrayal is information. They think they can steal what belongs to you because they believe you won't fight back. They have mistaken kindness for weakness, just as so many have done with me over the years. But blood doesn't make people worthy. Rachel, character does, and you are the only one in this family who has inherited mine. The letter went on to detail suspicious financial transactions she'd discovered in the months before her death. Money moved between accounts. Irregularities in the family business that pointed to something far more serious than mere favoritism. But it was the final paragraph that sent chills down my spine. Use what I have left you. Don't look back, don't apologize, and don't give them a second chance to destroy you. They have forgotten that I taught you to be a fighter. Remind them. With shaking fingers, I picked up the digital recorder. It was small, modern, not the kind of device I would have expected her to own. I pressed play, and her voice filled the silent bedroom with crystalline clarity. This is Evelyn Monroe, recording on November 15th, 2023. I am of sound mind and body, and I am making this statement as additional evidence of my true intentions regarding my estate. Her voice was strong, commanding, the voice of a woman who had spent decades making decisions that others were afraid to make. If something happens to me, if my family attempts to circumvent my wishes or deny Rachel her rightful inheritance, this recording serves as proof of my mental state and my clear directive. Rachel is the only member of this family I trust completely. She is the only one who has shown genuine care for others without calculating personal gain. She is the only one worthy of carrying forward what I have built. The recording continued for nearly 20 minutes, detailing her observations about Dad's growing gambling debts, his secret loans against the business, and Elise's involvement in what sounded like sophisticated financial fraud. She had been collecting evidence for months, preparing for a confrontation that death had prevented her from having. But she had prepared for that possibility too. The codicil was devastatingly thorough, in legal language that left no room for interpretation. It revoked all previous bequests to Harold and Elise Monroe, transferring the entirety of her estate, including her 40% controlling interest in Monroe and Sterling Capital, to me. The document was witnessed by her doctor and her attorney, both of whom had signed affidavits attesting to her mental competency at the time of signing. I sat on her bedroom floor as darkness fell outside, surrounded by the evidence of my family's betrayal and my grandmother's fierce protection. She had known they would try to erase me, and she had made sure I would have the weapons to fight back. The woman they thought they knew, the quiet, accommodating Rachel who would accept whatever scraps they threw her, had never really existed. She was a character I'd played to keep the peace, to maintain the illusion of family harmony that everyone seemed to value more than truth. But Grandmother Evelyn had seen through the performance to the person underneath. She had recognized her own steel in me, even when I couldn't see it myself. As I carefully gathered the documents and the recorder, her final words from the recording echoed in my mind. Don't let them make you small, Rachel. You were born to fight. Now show them what a Monroe woman can do when she stops pretending to be weak. The war they'd started in that kitchen 3 nights ago was about to take a very different turn than they'd planned. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It took 3 weeks of careful planning, of becoming someone my family wouldn't recognize even if they bothered to look closely enough to notice. First, I moved my money, every dollar from my freelance business, every cent from the small inheritance I'd received from my maternal grandfather, every penny I'd saved over the years. All of it disappeared into a new account at a bank across town. The account was under my name, but at an institution where the Monroe family had no connections, no favors to call in, no influence to leverage. I told no one about the transfer. As far as my family knew, I was still the financially dependent daughter who lived paycheck to paycheck, always just one client away from asking Dad for help with rent. It was a useful fiction that I'd never bothered to correct, and now it would serve as perfect camouflage. Next, I found myself a lawyer, not just any attorney, but Margaret Steinberg, a woman whose reputation for handling complex estate disputes was matched only by her legendary ruthlessness in court. Her office was in downtown Cleveland, 43 floors above the street in a glass tower that reflected the sky like a mirror. "Interesting situation," she said after I'd laid out everything, the overheard conversation, the documents from Grandmother Evelyn, the evidence of systematic exclusion. Margaret was in her 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that seemed to calculate angles and advantages with mathematical precision. Your grandmother was clearly a woman who understood preparation. "She was a survivor," I said. "She learned early that people will take everything from you if you let them. And are you prepared to stop letting them?" I thought about that question as I walked back to my car through the autumn afternoon. Was I prepared? 3 weeks ago, I would have said no. 3 weeks ago, I was still the peacekeeper, still clinging to the hope that family meant something beyond shared DNA and mutual financial interest. But Grandmother Evelyn had left me more than documents and recordings. She'd left me permission to stop pretending that keeping the peace was worth more than keeping my dignity. The real work began with forensic accounting. Margaret recommended a firm that specialized in uncovering financial irregularities, and within days, I had a team of investigators quietly dissecting every transaction that had passed through Monroe and Sterling Capital in the past 5 years. What they found was staggering. Dad hadn't just been gambling, he'd been losing systematically, feeding money into offshore sports betting accounts with the desperate consistency of an addict chasing his losses. Over 18 months, he'd moved nearly $200,000 from the business accounts to cover his debts, always intending to pay it back, always believing the next bet would be the one that made him whole. But it was Elise's involvement that truly shocked me. She hadn't just enabled Dad's gambling, she'd used it as cover for her own schemes. Shell companies registered in Delaware, phantom consulting fees paid to entities that existed only on paper, client funds temporarily borrowed for personal investments and replaced before anyone noticed. She'd been running a sophisticated embezzlement operation under the guise of helping Dad hide his addiction from Mom. They'd been using Grandmother Evelyn's money, too, her investment account, which they'd been managing since she'd gotten too frail to handle it herself, showed regular withdrawals for medical expenses and home improvements that had never materialized. They'd been treating her portfolio like their personal piggy bank, confident that she was too old and too trusting to audit their work. I sat in my apartment at 1:15 in the morning, surrounded by spreadsheets and bank statements that painted a picture of casual, ongoing theft. These weren't desperate people making desperate choices. These were calculated criminals who'd been stealing from an elderly woman while smiling at her across the dinner table every Sunday. The irony was almost beautiful. They'd been planning to cut me out of an inheritance they'd already stolen. They were going to exclude me from receiving money that no longer existed, at least not in the accounts where it was supposed to be. But Grandmother Evelyn had been smarter than all of us. Her real money, the bulk of her wealth, had been moved months before her death into a trust that they'd known nothing about. The account they'd been pilfering was essentially a honeypot, a trap baited with enough money to make them feel clever while the real assets remained safely beyond their reach. She'd been watching them steal from her, documenting every theft, building a case that would not only restore my inheritance but also destroy them legally and financially. Over the following weeks, I became a ghost in my own life. I went through the motions of normal family interaction, showing up for Dad's birthday dinner, helping Mom plan Thanksgiving, listening to Elise complain about work stress with expressions of sisterly sympathy. But inside, I was collecting every detail, every casual lie, every moment of manufactured warmth that was really just a performance designed to keep me compliant. They thought I was the same old Rachel, slightly distracted perhaps, maybe a little quieter than usual, but fundamentally unchanged. They had no idea that I was studying them with the intensity of a scientist observing dangerous specimens. The hardest part was maintaining the pretense of ignorance when they made their jokes about my financial struggles, their gentle suggestions that I should be more practical about my career choices. their carefully worded implications that I should be grateful for whatever place they chose to give me in the family structure. "You're so lucky you don't have to worry about all this business stuff," Elise said one evening as we sat in Mom's living room, gesturing vaguely toward the stack of financial documents she'd brought home. "It's so stressful, managing all of Grandmother's affairs on top of everything else." I nodded sympathetically, as if I didn't know that those documents represented months of systematic theft, as if I hadn't spent the previous evening with forensic accountants calculating exactly how much they'd stolen and how long they'd been stealing it. "You're doing such a good job taking care of everything," I told her, and watched her smile with satisfied pride. Soon, very soon, that smile was going to disappear forever. The confrontation came on a Saturday morning in November, when the first snow of the season was beginning to dust the windows of my parents' kitchen. I'd timed it perfectly, late enough that everyone would be awake and caffeinated, early enough that no one would have anywhere urgent to be. Family breakfast had always been sacred in the Monroe household, one of Mom's traditions that had somehow survived decades of changing schedules and competing priorities. I arrived at 9:45, carrying a bakery box of croissants and wearing the kind of soft smile that had always made them underestimate me. Dad was reading the Wall Street Journal at the head of the table. Mom was fussing with the coffee maker, and Elise was scrolling through her phone with the distracted air of someone too important to be fully present. "Rachel." Mom's voice carried that forced brightness she used when she was trying to manufacture harmony. "What a lovely surprise. I wasn't expecting you this morning." "I brought breakfast," I said, setting the bakery box on the counter. "And I wanted to discuss something with all of you while we're together." I reached into my purse and withdrew the manila envelope that had been waiting in Grandmother Evelyn's closet, placing it gently on the kitchen table between the orange juice and the butter dish. The envelope looked innocent enough, aged manila paper with my name written in familiar handwriting, but I watched the way their eyes fixed on it with the intensity of prey animals sensing a predator. "What's that?" Elise asked, though something in her voice suggested she already suspected this wasn't going to be good news. "Something I found at Grandmother's house," I said, settling into my usual chair with the casual air of someone announcing the weather. "I've been going through her things, like we discussed, and I came across this hidden in her bedroom closet." Dad looked up from his newspaper, his reading glasses sliding down his nose. "Hidden your grandmother didn't hide things, Rachel. She was very organized, very straightforward." Was she?" I opened the envelope with deliberate slowness, enjoying the way their attention focused on my hands like spotlights. "Because this envelope was sealed with wax and hidden behind a loose panel. That seems pretty intentional to me." I withdrew the codicil first, the legal document that would change everything, but I didn't unfold it yet. Instead, I placed it on the table and watched their faces. Mom had stopped fussing with the coffee. Elise had set down her phone. Dad had folded his newspaper and was giving me his full attention for perhaps the first time in years. "What does it say?" Mom's voice was carefully neutral, but I caught the slight tremor underneath. "It's a codicil to her will," I said, "dated 2 months before she died, properly witnessed and notarized." I paused, letting that information settle. "Would you like me to read it to you?" "That's impossible," Elise said quickly. "We were her attorneys. We handled all her legal documents. There's no way she could have executed a codicil without us knowing about it." I smiled at her, the same gentle smile I'd been giving my family for 36 years. "She used different attorneys. Elise, Margaret Steinberg's firm downtown. Apparently, she felt it was important to keep this particular document confidential." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Dad's face had gone pale, and I could see him calculating dates and implications with the desperate speed of a man trying to solve a puzzle before the timer ran out. "Rachel," he said carefully, "whatever you think you've found, we should discuss this calmly. Family matters require family solutions." "Family matters," I repeated, tasting the words. "Like the family discussions you've been having about my inheritance, the ones where you decided I don't deserve a dime." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the kitchen clock ticking on the wall, counting off the seconds until everything changed forever. Mom recovered first, her face rearranging itself into an expression of confused hurt. "Sweetheart, I don't know what you think you heard, but I heard exactly what you said." My voice remained steady, conversational. "Tuesday night, 11:30. I came to drop off Dad's medication and heard the three of you planning to write me out of the inheritance entirely." Elise leaned forward, her business training kicking in as she tried to regain control of the situation. "Rachel, you're taking things out of context. We were discussing practical matters, the complexities of estate planning." Were you?" I unfolded the codicil and placed it flat on the table where they could all see it. "Because this document suggests that Grandmother Evelyn had some very different ideas about practicality." Dad reached for the paper, but I placed my hand over it, keeping it just out of his reach. "It revokes all previous bequests to Harold and Elise Monroe," I said, watching their faces as each word landed like a physical blow. "The entirety of her estate, including her controlling interest in Monroe and Sterling Capital, passes to me." "That's ridiculous!" Elise snapped, her careful composure finally cracking. "Grandmother would never. She knew I was the one who understood the business, who was prepared to carry on the family legacy." "The family legacy," I interrupted, "that you've been systematically stealing from for the past 2 years." The kitchen went dead silent. Even the coffee maker seemed to stop gurgling. Dad's face had gone from pale to gray. "Rachel, whatever you think you know." "I know about the gambling debts. Dad, I know about the money you've been moving from business accounts to cover your losses. I know about the shell companies, Elise, and the phantom consulting fees, and the client funds you've been borrowing for your personal investments." I reached back into the envelope and withdrew the digital recorder, placing it on the table next to the codicil. "But you don't have to take my word for it. Grandmother left me something else." My finger hovered over the play button as I looked around the table at their faces. Dad's growing panic, Mom's confusion, Elise's desperate calculation of damage control options. "She was watching you," I said softly, "for months before she died. She was documenting everything, building a case, preparing for exactly this moment." I pressed play, and Grandmother Evelyn's voice filled the kitchen with the authority of someone speaking from beyond the grave. "This is Evelyn Monroe, recording on November 15th, 2023. As her words filled the room, detailing their crimes with clinical precision, I watched my family realize that their carefully constructed plans had just collapsed into rubble. The breakfast that was supposed to be a peaceful family gathering had become a trial, and they were about to discover that the quiet daughter they'd written off as harmless had learned to fight from the most dangerous woman they'd ever known. The war was no longer coming. It had arrived. Elise lunged for the recorder before Grandmother Evelyn's voice had finished the first sentence. Her chair scraped against the kitchen floor as she reached across the table, her manicured fingers grasping for the device that was destroying her future word by word. I was faster. My hand closed over the recorder and pulled it back against my chest, while my other arm swept the codicil safely out of her reach. Years of being the family doormat had taught me to anticipate their moves, to protect myself even when I hadn't realized I was doing it. "Give me that," Elise's voice cracked with desperation. "You don't understand what you're doing. Rachel, you're going to destroy everything." "I'm not destroying anything," I said, holding the recorder steady as Grandmother Evelyn's voice continued to fill the kitchen with devastating clarity. "I'm just letting the truth speak." Harold's gambling debts have reached critical levels, funded by systematic withdrawals from business accounts that he believes I haven't noticed. The pattern suggests addiction rather than mere poor judgment. Dad tried to stand, his hand reaching toward the recorder, but Mom grabbed his wrist and pulled him back down. Her face had gone white as she finally understood what she was hearing. "Harold," she whispered, "what is she talking about? What gambling debts?" "Marjorie, I can explain," Dad started, but Grandmother Evelyn's recorded voice cut through his protest like a scalpel. Elise has proven equally disappointing, though her crimes show more sophistication. The shell companies registered in Delaware, the consulting fees paid to entities that exist only on paper, the temporary borrowing of client funds for personal investments she believes her MBA has made her clever enough to hide her theft. "Turn it off!" Elise's voice rose to a near shriek. "This is insane!" She was old. She was confused. She didn't understand modern business practices. But even as she protested, I could see the fear in her eyes, not the fear of being falsely accused, but the terror of someone whose carefully hidden crimes were being exposed in excruciating detail. Most disturbing is their willingness to steal from me directly. The medical expenses that were never incurred, the home improvements that never materialized, the gradual draining of accounts they believed I was too frail to monitor. They have been feeding off my resources like parasites. Mom's coffee cup slipped from her nerveless fingers, shattering against the kitchen floor in a spray of ceramic and dark liquid. She stared at Dad and Elise as if seeing them for the first time. "Is this true?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "Have you been stealing from your own mother?" "It's not stealing," Dad said desperately. "It's family money. It was always going to be family money. I was just managing it differently." "Managing it into your bookie's pocket," I said, my voice cutting through his justifications. $200,000 in 18 months. Dad, that's not managing. That's addiction. Elise tried a different approach, her business training kicking in as she attempted damage control. "Rachel, you need to think about this practically. Even if some of what she's saying is technically accurate, dragging this through the courts will destroy the family business. It will hurt all of us, including you." "Why, will it?" I let Grandmother Evelyn's recording continue while I looked at each of them in turn. "Because according to this codicil, I now own 40% of Monroe and Sterling Capital. That makes me the majority shareholder, doesn't it?" The math hit them like a physical blow. Dad owned 35%. Elise owned 25%. If I controlled Grandmother's 40%, I didn't just have a stake in the business, I had complete control. "You can't be serious," Elise breathed. "You don't know anything about running an investment firm. You'll run it into the ground." "Maybe," I agreed. "Or maybe I'll run it honestly for the first time in years. Clean house, report the irregularities to the appropriate authorities. Make sure our clients know exactly how their money has been handled." If Rachel is hearing this recording, it means they have proceeded with their plan to exclude her from the inheritance. I want her to know that she is the only member of this family I trust completely. She is the only one who has inherited my spine. Dad slumped in his chair as Grandmother Evelyn's words washed over him. The confident patriarch who had dismissed me so casually 3 nights ago looked like a deflated balloon, his face gray with the realization that his mother had been watching his every move, documenting his failures, preparing his destruction. "Rachel," he said, his voice hoarse. "She's my mother. Whatever mistakes I've made, whatever problems I've had, we can work this out as a family. We don't need lawyers. We don't need courts." "Family," I repeated, tasting the word. "Is that what you call conspiracy to defraud an inheritance? Is that what you call stealing from an elderly woman? Is that what you call erasing your own daughter from family photos and conversations?" Mom looked up from the broken coffee cup at her feet, confusion and dawning horror warring in her expression. "What photos? What conversations?" I pulled out my phone and began scrolling through the screenshots I'd prepared, the Facebook posts, the cropped pictures, the group chat exclusions. They've been systematically removing me from the family narrative for months. Mom, preparing for this moment when they would cut me out entirely. As I showed her image after image of my careful erasure, I watched her face crumble. Whatever she had known or suspected about the inheritance plans, she clearly hadn't understood the deliberate cruelty of it. "Don't let them make you small, Rachel. You were born to fight. Show them what a Monroe woman can do when she stops pretending to be weak." Grandmother Evelyn's final words on the recording echoed in the silence that followed. I turned off the device and looked around the table at the ruins of my family. "She was right," I said softly. "I have been pretending to be weak, pretending that keeping the peace was more important than keeping my dignity, pretending that family loyalty meant accepting whatever scraps you chose to throw me." I stood up, gathering the codicil and the recorder with steady hands. "But she taught me something else too. She taught me that the only thing worse than being betrayed is letting people get away with it." Elise made one last desperate grab for the documents, but I stepped back smoothly, keeping them out of her reach. "The attorneys will be in touch," I told them, my voice carrying the quiet authority that Grandmother Evelyn had always possessed. "I suggest you get yourselves legal representation. You're going to need it." As I walked toward the kitchen door, Mom's voice followed me, broken and pleading. "Rachel, please, we're still family." I paused at the threshold and looked back at them, Dad slumped in defeat, Elise calculating her next move, Mom surrounded by the wreckage of her illusions. "No," I said, "we're not. Family doesn't steal from each other. Family doesn't erase each other. And family doesn't plan to rob their own daughter and call it justice." I left them sitting in their perfect kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of their crimes and the echoes of their grandmother's judgment. The quiet daughter they had dismissed was walking away, and she was taking everything with her. The courtroom at 10:15 on a gray December morning felt like a theater where the final act was about to begin. I sat beside Margaret Steinberg at the plaintiff's table, watching as my family filed in through the heavy oak doors with their hastily assembled legal team. They looked smaller somehow, diminished by the formal setting and the weight of evidence that had been building against them for weeks. Dad's lawyer was a nervous young man who kept shuffling papers and whispering urgent consultations. Elise had hired someone more expensive, a silver-haired attorney from a downtown firm who radiated the kind of confidence that came from handling wealthy clients' embarrassing problems. But even he looked uncomfortable as he reviewed the documents that Margaret had filed. The forensic accounting had been devastating. Every theft documented, every fraudulent transaction traced, every lie exposed with mathematical precision. The investigators had found patterns of embezzlement going back 3 years, sophisticated enough to avoid casual detection but sloppy enough to crumble under professional scrutiny. Judge Patricia Williams called the proceeding to order, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen every variation of family greed in her 20-year career. "We're here today for the matter of Monroe versus Monroe, regarding the estate of Evelyn Monroe and allegations of financial impropriety." Margaret stood with the fluid grace of a predator who had been waiting months for this moment. "Your Honor, we will demonstrate that the defendants engaged in a systematic campaign of financial fraud against the deceased, Evelyn Monroe, while simultaneously conspiring to deprive the rightful heir of her inheritance through deliberate deception and document manipulation." She began methodically, building the case like an architect constructing an unshakable foundation. The codicil was entered into evidence, along with testimony from the witnesses who had watched Grandmother Evelyn sign it. The doctor confirmed her mental competency. The attorney verified the proper execution of the document. Then came the recordings. As Grandmother Evelyn's voice filled the courtroom, detailing their crimes with clinical precision, I watched my family's faces. Dad stared at his hands, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his mother's posthumous judgment. Mom sat in the gallery behind them, tears streaming down her face as she heard exactly how her husband and stepdaughter had been stealing from the woman who had welcomed her into the family 40 years ago. But it was Elise who fascinated me most. She sat rigid in her chair, her face a mask of professional composure, even as her grandmother's voice dismantled her defense piece by piece. She was still calculating, still looking for angles and escape routes, still believing she could talk her way out of the consequences. "The defendant Elise Monroe established no fewer than 6 shell companies," Margaret continued, projecting bank statements on the courtroom screen. These entities existed solely to facilitate the transfer of client funds and estate money into personal accounts. The numbers told the story with brutal clarity. Consulting fees to companies that had no employees, no offices, no legitimate business purpose, money flowing in complex patterns designed to obscure its origin and destination, professional theft dressed up in the language of modern finance. Elise's attorney tried to mount a defense based on family business practices and informal arrangements, but Margaret demolished each argument with documentation and precedent. When he suggested that the codicil was the product of an elderly woman's confusion, she presented testimony from grandmother Evelyn's doctor showing perfect cognitive function right up until her death. "Your Honor," Dad's lawyer said during his turn, "my client acknowledges that there were irregularities in his handling of family finances, but these were the actions of a man struggling with addiction, not a criminal enterprise." Margaret's response was surgical. The defendant's gambling addiction may explain his motivation, but it does not excuse his methods. Stealing from an elderly family member to fund a sports betting habit is not a medical condition, it's a crime. The evidence kept mounting: bank records, email communications, recorded phone calls that the forensic team had uncovered. Elise had been careless in her digital communications, leaving a trail of messages that showed not just the mechanics of the theft, but the casual arrogance with which she'd approached it. "As you can see from Exhibit 47, Margaret said, displaying an email Elise had sent to a co-conspirator. The defendant refers to the deceased's accounts as the old lady's money and discusses timing the withdrawals so she doesn't notice. This shows clear intent to deceive and defraud." When it came time for Elise to take the stand, she tried to present herself as a responsible businesswoman making difficult decisions in complex family circumstances. But Margaret's cross-examination was relentless. "You established Meridian Consulting in Delaware on March 15th, 2022, correct?" "Yes, but that was for legitimate business purposes." What services did Meridian Consulting provide?" A pause. "Strategic financial planning." "To whom?" Another pause, longer this time. "Various clients." "Can you name a single client who received services from Meridian Consulting?" Silence. "Sir, can you produce any documentation of work performed by this company other than invoices submitted to Monroe and Sterling Capital?" "The documentation is complex." "Ms. Monroe, isn't it true that Meridian Consulting was created solely to justify payments from your family's business to your personal accounts?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Elise's careful composure finally cracked. "You don't understand the pressures we were under," she snapped. "Dad was hemorrhaging money, the business was struggling, and we had to make decisions to protect what grandmother had built. By stealing from her, by managing resources that were going to be family resources anyway." It was the confession Margaret had been waiting for, not the careful admission of a professional making difficult choices, but the angry justification of someone who believed she was entitled to whatever she could take. "So you felt entitled to spend your grandmother's money without her knowledge or consent?" "I felt responsible for protecting the family legacy." "By committing fraud?" "By doing what needed to be done." The outburst echoed in the silent courtroom. Even Elise's expensive attorney looked defeated, knowing that his client had just destroyed any hope of a sympathetic verdict. Judge Williams called for a brief recess, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. When court reconvened 30 minutes later, her ruling was swift and comprehensive. The evidence clearly establishes that defendants Harold Monroe and Elise Monroe engaged in systematic embezzlement from the estate of Evelyn Monroe, she said. "The codicil to Mrs. Monroe's will is valid and properly executed, making Rachel Monroe the rightful heir to the entire estate." She paused, looking directly at Dad and Elise. "Furthermore, this court is referring the evidence of financial fraud to the district attorney's office for potential criminal prosecution." The gavel came down with the finality of thunder. In that moment, watching my family's world collapse under the weight of their own greed, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, not satisfaction, Just a profound sense of justice finally served, and the quiet certainty that Grandmother Evelyn would have approved. The woman they had tried to erase had just reclaimed everything they'd tried to steal, and this time, there would be no appeals, no second chances, no family discussions to explain away the consequences of their choices. The truth had spoken, and it had spoken loudly enough for everyone to hear. The silence in the hallway outside the courtroom was deafening. As the heavy oak doors swung shut behind us, my family stood frozen in a tableau of defeat and disbelief. The confident conspirators who had planned my erasure just months ago now looked like strangers to each other, the bonds of their alliance severed by the weight of exposed truth. I didn't need to gloat. I didn't need to deliver a final speech about justice or karma. The moment spoke for itself with a clarity that required no embellishment. Dad stood with his shoulders hunched, staring at the marble floor as if it might offer him some escape from the reality of what had just happened. The gambling addiction that had started this cascade of theft would soon be the least of his problems. Federal prosecutors didn't show mercy to financial advisors who stole from elderly clients, even when those clients were their own mothers. Mom emerged from the courtroom looking 20 years older than she had that morning, her face etched with the devastation of someone whose entire world had been revealed as a lie. She looked at me with something that might have been an appeal for forgiveness, but I had no comfort to offer her. She had stood by while they planned to erase me, and silence in the face of injustice was its own form of betrayal. But it was Elise who commanded my attention in those final moments. Even in defeat, she radiated a kind of furious disbelief, as if the universe had somehow violated the natural order by refusing to let her get away with her crimes. She stared at me with the incredulous rage of someone who had always gotten what she wanted and couldn't comprehend why that had suddenly changed. "You've destroyed everything," she said, her voice low and venomous. "The business, the family, 40 years of building something meaningful, all because you couldn't accept that some people are simply better suited for responsibility." I looked at her for a long moment. This woman who had shared a childhood with me, who had sat at the same dinner table for decades, who had helped plan birthday parties and holiday celebrations while secretly orchestrating my systematic exclusion from the family story. "I didn't destroy anything, Elise," I said quietly. "I just stopped letting you steal it." She opened her mouth to respond, but Margaret touched my elbow gently. "We should go," she said. "The press is waiting outside." The press. I had forgotten about them. Forgotten that the Monroe family's financial empire was prominent enough to warrant coverage when it collapsed under the weight of its own corruption. As we walked toward the courthouse steps, I could see the news vans lined up outside, reporters with their cameras and microphones ready to document the final act of this family tragedy. But I felt no anxiety about facing them. For the first time in my adult life, I had nothing to hide, nothing to apologize for, nothing to explain away or minimize. I was walking into the light of public scrutiny with clean hands and a clear conscience. The reporters clustered around us as we emerged into the December afternoon, their questions overlapping in a cacophony of professional curiosity. But I barely heard them. My attention was focused on something else entirely. Across the street, parked beneath a bare maple tree, was a familiar black sedan. Through the windshield, I could see the silhouette of someone waiting, someone who had been following this story from the beginning and wanted to witness its conclusion. I couldn't make out the details from this distance, but somehow I knew it was someone who understood what this moment meant, someone who recognized that justice delayed is not justice denied, that truth has its own timeline, and that sometimes the quiet ones are the most dangerous of all. Margaret handled the press conference with professional efficiency, outlining the court's findings and the implications for ongoing criminal investigations. I stood beside her, answering questions with the same calm certainty that had carried me through the trial. Yes, I planned to take active control of Monroe and Sterling Capital. Yes, I would be implementing new oversight procedures. No, I felt no sadness about the destruction of family relationships that had been built on lies and exploitation. When the reporters finally dispersed and Margaret had gone back to her office to handle the paperwork, I found myself alone on the courthouse steps. The black sedan was gone, but its presence had left me with a sense of completion that went beyond legal victory or financial restoration. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to Grandmother Evelyn's final voicemail, the one she had left me just days before her death. I had listened to it dozens of times in the weeks since discovering her hidden evidence, but now I heard it with new understanding. "Rachel, dear," her voice said, tinny but strong through the phone's speaker. "I want you to remember something your grandfather used to tell me: the truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. It just needs to stand firm." As I walked down the courthouse steps toward my car, toward my new life as the sole inheritor of everything my family had tried to steal, those words echoed in my mind with the resonance of prophecy fulfilled. I had stood firm. The truth had been heard, and the people who had thought they could erase me from the story had discovered that some erasures leave marks of their own. The quiet daughter they had dismissed was walking away with everything, and she wasn't looking back. Thank you for listening to this story of family betrayal and ultimate justice. I'd love to hear from you. Comment below and let me know where you're listening from so we can connect with fellow story lovers around the world. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts about Rachel's journey from erasure to empowerment.